1 year after the conquest of Earth, Officer Ji-won found Minji in the garden she had planted behind the logistics center in Seoul. The garden was small and technically unauthorized, but no Valkyrie had complained because the vegetables Minji grew there had improved the quality of meals for everyone in the facility. Ji-won watched her work for several minutes before she acknowledged his presence, and he noticed that her hands moved with the patient efficiency that he had come to associate with everything humans did. "You have been avoiding me," he said when she finally looked up from the soil. Minji wiped her hands on her clothing and stood to face him with an expression that held no guilt or apology. "I have been busy," she said simply, "and there is much work to be done." Ji-won felt his scales shift to the angry red that his people displayed when they were frustrated beyond patience. "I have watched your people for a year now," he said with a voice that trembled with emotions he could barely control. "And I have seen what you are doing, even if no one else will admit it." Minji tilted her head in that gesture he had learned meant she was listening carefully. "What do you think we are doing?" she asked with genuine curiosity in her voice. "You are conquering us," Ji-won said, "and you are doing it so slowly and so quietly that most of my people do not even realize it is happening." He expected her to deny it, and he expected her to laugh or to pretend confusion. But instead, she simply nodded with a sadness in her eyes that he did not understand. "Come," she said, as she gestured toward a bench at the edge of the garden, "and I will explain because you deserve to know the truth." They sat together as the sun set over the city that had once been a proud human capital and was now just another Dominion administrative center. "Do you know how many times humanity has been conquered?" Minji asked in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Ji-won shook his head, and his scales shifted to the pale blue of uncertainty. "We have been conquered more times than we can count," Minji continued. "And we have been invaded and occupied and enslaved by enemies from within our own species long before your people ever found us." She looked up at the sky where Valkyrie warships still orbited as a constant reminder of who held power over Earth. "Empires come and empires go," she said softly, "and every conqueror believes they will rule forever. And every single one of them has been wrong." Ji-won felt something cold settle in his chest as he began to understand what she was telling him. "You are waiting for us to fall," he said. Minji smiled, and the expression held no malice but also no mercy. "We are not waiting for anything," she replied, "and we are simply doing what we have always done when faced with powers greater than ourselves." She turned to face him directly, and her eyes held a patience that seemed impossibly ancient for someone so young. "We survive," she said, "and we adapt, and we make ourselves so useful that removing us would cause more damage than keeping us." Ji-won thought about the reactor on Kethfor and the famine on Verdes Prime and the shipyards of Tehran Station. "And when the Dominion falls?" he asked, with scales that had faded to the gray of dawning horror. "When the Dominion falls," Minji said, "humanity will still be standing, and we will still be needed because no one else will know how to keep the lights on or the food growing or the ships flying." She reached out and placed her hand on his claw in a gesture of comfort that felt genuine despite everything she had just admitted. "We do not wish you harm," she said gently, "and we do not hate your people or want revenge for the invasion." "Then what do you want?" Ji-won demanded. Minji was silent for a long moment as she considered the question. "We want to survive," she finally said. "And we want our children to survive. And we want humanity to still exist when the universe grows cold and the last stars burn out." She gestured at the garden around them with its rows of vegetables and flowers growing in soil that had been barren a year ago. "We are gardeners," she said, "and we plant seeds wherever we go, and we tend them with patience because we know that some seeds take generations to grow." Ji-won looked at the garden and saw it with new eyes, and he understood that it was not just a collection of plants, but a symbol of everything humanity represented. "You are not resisting our rule," he said slowly as the realization crystallized in his mind. "No," Minji agreed. "You are not plotting rebellion or waiting for rescue. No. You are simply weaving yourself so deeply into everything we do that when we fall apart, you will be the threads holding civilization together." Minji smiled. And this time, the expression held warmth and something that looked almost like affection. "Now you understand," she said. A communication device chirped at Ji-won's belt, and he answered it with claws that felt numb and distant. The voice on the other end belonged to Admiral Seong-ho, and the old commander sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "3 border worlds have declared independence from the Dominion," Seong-ho reported, "and they have specifically requested human administrators to help them establish new governments." Ji-won looked at Minji, and she looked back at him with eyes that held no surprise. "The seeds are beginning to grow," she said quietly as Seong-ho continued his report of a dominion that was starting to crack along fault lines no one had noticed until now. Ji-won ended the communication and sat in silence as darkness fell over the garden and the city and the world that humans had lost and were somehow in the process of winning back. "What happens now?" he asked. Minji stood and offered him her hand in a gesture that crossed the boundaries between their species in ways that should have been impossible. "Now we work together," she said, "because that is what humans do, and because helping your people survive what is coming is better than watching you fall." Ji-won took her hand and felt the warmth of human skin against his scales, and he wondered if this was how all conquests ended, not with rebellion or war or dramatic confrontation, but with patient hands reaching out to help the conquerors become something new. Fleet Admiral Seong-ho stood on the observation deck of his flagship and watched Earth burn beneath him, and he felt nothing but satisfaction at another successful conquest for the Velthari Dominion. The war had lasted exactly 93 days, which was longer than he had expected but shorter than his superiors had feared. And now the blue and green world that humans called home belonged to the Dominion like so many others before it. His scale shifted from dark green to a pleased amber as he reviewed the final casualty reports, and he noted with approval that human military resistance had collapsed completely in the final week of fighting. "Admiral," his aide Ji-won said from behind him, "the planetary governors are requesting your presence at the formal surrender ceremony." Seong-ho turned away from the viewport and regarded the young officer with ancient eyes that had seen dozens of worlds fall to Velthari might, and he found himself impressed by how smoothly this particular invasion had concluded. "The humans fought well at first," he said as he walked toward the shuttle bay, "but they understood when they were beaten, and that shows wisdom I did not expect from such a young species." Jaewon followed 2 steps behind as protocol demanded, and the young officer's scales flickered with uncertainty that Seong-ho pretended not to notice. The shuttle ride down to the surface took them through skies still thick with smoke from the final battles, and Seong-ho observed the ruined cities below with the clinical detachment of a professional conqueror. He had done this same thing on 12 other worlds, and each time the pattern repeated itself in ways that comforted him with their predictability. First came the military defeat, then the formal surrender, then the installation of puppet governments, and finally the extraction of resources that would feed the ever-hungry Dominion Earth would be no different. Or so he believed as the shuttle touched down outside what the humans called the United Nations building. Human leaders waited in a long line outside the damaged structure, and Seong-ho noted with approval that they wore formal clothing and carried no weapons. He stepped off the shuttle ramp and let the weight of silence announce his presence before he spoke. "I am Fleet Admiral Seong-ho of the Velthari Dominion," he announced in a harsh human language he had learned during the invasion. "And I accept your unconditional surrender on behalf of the Dominion Council." A human female stepped forward from the line of leaders, and her face showed no fear as she bowed in the manner his cultural advisors had suggested would show appropriate respect. "I am Secretary General Park Yuna," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the ruined plaza. "And on behalf of humanity, I offer our complete cooperation with the Dominion's authority." Seong-ho felt his scales shift with surprise he quickly suppressed, because conquered peoples usually offered cooperation, eventually, but rarely so immediately and never so calmly. He studied the human leader's face for signs of deception or hidden defiance, but he found only a patient acceptance that made him deeply uncomfortable, for reasons he could not name. "Your cooperation is noted and will be reported to the council," he said after a pause that lasted longer than he intended. "And your people will be treated according to Dominion law as long as that cooperation continues." The ceremony proceeded according to the scripts his advisors had prepared, and documents were signed and seals were applied, and the formal business of conquest was completed. But throughout the entire process, Seong-ho could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. And that feeling only grew stronger as the days passed and the occupation began in earnest. He assigned Valkyrie governors to every major human population center, and he stationed troops in every city. And he established the communication networks that would allow him to monitor and control his new subjects, and the humans did exactly what he told them to do, which should have pleased him, but instead made him more uneasy with each passing week. They reported for labor assignments without complaint, and they provided detailed information about their infrastructure without being asked. And they volunteered for positions in Valkyrie installations with an eagerness that seemed almost desperate. Admiral Ji-won reported one morning as Seong-ho reviewed the daily occupation briefings. "We have received over 10,000 applications from humans, requesting positions in our maintenance and administrative divisions." Seong-ho looked up from his screens with a frown that darkened his scales to a troubled gray. 10,000 volunteers, he repeated slowly. "And what do they want in return for this service?" Ji-won consulted the datapad in his claws and shook his head in obvious confusion. "Nothing, Admiral. And they specifically state that they wish only to help the occupation proceed smoothly and to demonstrate humanity's value to the Dominion." This was wrong, and Seong-ho knew it was wrong, even though he could not explain why to his subordinates or even to himself. Conquered peoples did not volunteer to help their conquerors, and they did not offer their services without demanding something in return. And they certainly did not seem pleased to be occupied. But when Seong-ho walked through the streets of the human cities he had conquered, he saw faces that watched him not with hatred or fear, but with something that looked almost like patience. The humans were waiting for something, and that realization kept Seong-ho awake at night as he tried to understand what game they were playing. He increased surveillance and planted informants and analyzed every piece of data his intelligence officers could gather. But he found no evidence of resistance networks or hidden weapons or plans for rebellion. The humans simply worked and waited and watched. And their calm acceptance of defeat was more terrifying than any army Seong-ho had ever faced. He sent a report to the Dominion Council expressing his concerns, and they responded with congratulations on another successful conquest and instructions to begin resource extraction immediately. Seong-ho obeyed his orders, because that was what a loyal officer did. But as he watched human workers flood into every Valkyrie installation on the planet, he could not escape the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. The humans were not defeated, and he was certain of this even though every piece of evidence said otherwise. They were simply waiting, and Seong-ho did not know what they were waiting for. And that uncertainty haunted him as the occupation of Earth continued according to plan. He stood again on his observation deck and watched the planet below. And this time, when his scales shifted color, they showed the dark blue of fear rather than the amber of satisfaction. Something was very wrong. And Seung-ho knew with terrible certainty that by the time he understood what the humans were doing, it would already be far too late to stop them. 3 months had passed since the surrender ceremony, and Officer Ji-won was beginning to understand why Admiral Seung-ho spent so many nights staring at reports with troubled eyes. The young Valkyrie had been assigned to oversee a logistics center in what the humans called Seoul. And his job was simple enough in theory, but it becomes something strange in practice. Every morning he arrived at the center to find human workers already there, and every evening he left to find them still working, and in between they did their jobs with an efficiency that made his scales itch with discomfort. "Officer Ji-won," a human voice called from behind him. "I noticed the third-floor cooling systems are running at reduced capacity, and I have already submitted a repair request to the maintenance division." Ji-won turned to face the speaker and found a young human woman named Minji smiling at him with an expression he had learned to recognize as friendly. "I was not aware of any cooling problems," he said slowly as he checked his datapad and found no alerts or warnings. "The problem only started an hour ago," Minji explained as she fell into step beside him, "and I wanted to make sure it was addressed before it affected the server equipment." Ji-won stopped walking and stared at the human with an intensity that should have frightened her, but seemed to have no effect at all. "How did you know about this problem before the automated systems detected it?" he demanded. Minji tilted her head in that strange human gesture that could mean many different things. "I listened to the machines," she said simply, "and that particular cooling unit has been making a small noise for 3 days now, and I knew it would fail eventually. This was impossible." And Ji-won knew it was impossible because Valkyrie engineers had designed those systems, and Valkyrie technicians had installed them, and no human should have understood them well enough to predict their failures. But when he checked the maintenance logs, he found that Minji had made 7 similar predictions in the past month, and every single one of them had been correct. "You seem troubled," Minji said with concern in her voice that sounded entirely genuine, "and I hope I have not overstepped by taking initiative without permission." Ji-won did not know how to answer, so he simply waved his claws in dismissal and continued his inspection of the facility. But as he walked through the corridors, he began to notice things he had overlooked before, and those things disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Every Valkyrie officer he passed was accompanied by at least one human assistant, and those assistants seemed to anticipate every need before it was spoken. When Commander Tiemann complained about the temperature in his office, a human worker appeared with climate controls already adjusted. When Lieutenant Sora mentioned missing a certain food from her homeworld, a human chef presented her with a dish that was almost identical to her mother's cooking. When Admiral Seung-ho himself struggled to communicate with the Dominion Council due to interference in the communication arrays, human technicians fixed the problem before he even finished describing it. The humans remembered everything, and they learned everything, and they made themselves useful in ways that no conquered species had ever done before. Ji-won found himself seeking out Minji more and more often as the weeks passed, and he told himself it was because he needed to understand the enemy he had been assigned to control. "Why do your people help us so willingly?" he asked her one evening as they shared a meal in the facility's dining area. Minji chewed her food slowly before answering, and Ji-won noticed that she ate the same bland rations as the Valkyrie staff, even though human cuisine was far more varied. "We want to be useful," she said finally. "And what else should we do now that the war is over?" "You could resist," Ji-won said, "and you could sabotage our equipment, or poison our food, or plot in secret to overthrow our rule." Minji laughed, and the sound was soft and genuine and somehow more frightening than any threat could have been. "Why would we do those things?" she asked with what seemed like honest confusion. "When working with you is so much easier and so much more productive." Jiwon wanted to argue, but he found that he could not find words to express the wrongness he felt in this situation. The humans should have been angry, and they should have been resentful, and they should have been looking for any opportunity to strike back at their conquerors. Instead, they smiled and worked and learned, and every day they became more essential to operations that Jiwon had once believed the Velthari could handle alone. He began to keep records of every system that humans have become involved with, and the list grew longer every week until it filled his datapad and spilled into secondary storage. Power distribution was managed by human technicians who knew every circuit and every backup protocol. Communication systems were maintained by human engineers who could diagnose problems faster than Velthari equipment could detect them. Food supplies were coordinated by human logistics experts who had memorized the dietary needs of every species in the Dominion, and the Velthari officers who had once commanded these systems now relied entirely on their human assistants to keep everything running. Minji, Jiwon said one night as they walked through the quiet corridors of the facility, "I need you to answer me honestly." The human woman looked at him with eyes that held no deception and no fear. "I always answer you honestly," she said, "and I always will, because trust is important between colleagues." Jiwon felt his scales shift to the dark blue, his people associated with fear, and he did not try to hide it. "What are your people doing?" he asked. "And why are you really making yourselves so essential to our operations?" Minji smiled, and in that smile, Jiwon saw something ancient and patient and utterly terrifying. "We are simply doing what humans have always done," she said softly, "and we are surviving in the only way we know how." She walked away before he could ask more questions, and Jiwon stood alone in the corridor with the terrible realization that no Velthari on Earth could operate any critical system without human assistance anymore. The occupation had continued according to plan, and every report said that everything was under control, and the Dominion Council was pleased with the progress of resource extraction. But Jiwon knew with sudden clarity that the humans had done something far more dangerous than rebellion. They had made themselves irreplaceable, and they had done it so quietly and so efficiently that no one had noticed until it was already complete. 6 months after the conquest of Earth, Fleet Admiral Seong-ho received a report from the mining world of Kethfor that made his blood run cold. The report was simple enough in its contents, and it described a near-catastrophic failure in one of the fusion reactors that powered the planet's extraction facilities. What made Seong-ho's scales turn the dark blue of fear was not the near disaster itself, but the way it had been prevented. Human workers had detected the reactor instability 3 days before any Velthari instruments showed warning signs, and they had implemented emergency protocols that Velthari engineers had not known existed, and they had saved the facility and everyone in it without asking for permission or recognition. Seong-ho read that report twice and then called for his aid with a voice that shook despite his best efforts to control it. "Jiwon," he said when the young officer arrived, "how many humans have been transported off Earth since the occupation began?" Jiwon consulted his datapad with claws that trembled slightly as he scrolled through the numbers. "Approximately 200,000, he reported, "and they have been distributed to 17 different Dominion worlds as laborers and technical assistants." Seong-ho closed his eyes and let out a breath that hissed between his teeth like steam escaping a damaged seal. "And on how many of those worlds have humans become essential to critical operations?" The silence that followed was answer enough, and when Jiwon finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "All of them, Admiral. And the pattern is identical on every world." Seong-ho stood and walked to the viewport that showed Earth rotating slowly beneath his flagship, and he wondered how he had failed to see this coming. The humans had not simply submitted to conquest, and they had not simply made themselves useful on their own world. They had spread like seeds carried on the wind. And everywhere they landed, they had taken root and grown until they were woven into the very fabric of Dominion infrastructure. He summoned a priority communication link to the Dominion Council, and he waited with growing dread as the connection was established across the vast distances of space. The face that appeared on his screen belonged to Counselor Haiyan Wu, who was the oldest member of the council and the most respected voice in Dominion politics, Admiral Seong Ho. The ancient Velthari said with a voice like dry leaves scraping across stone, "Your request for an emergency session was most unusual, and I have agreed to speak with you privately before bringing your concerns to the full council." Seong Ho bowed his head in gratitude and respect before speaking. "Honored Counselor," he began, "I believe that humanity poses a threat to the Dominion that we have never encountered before." The old counselor's scales shifted to a skeptical gray as he regarded Seong Ho through the screen. "The humans have been model subjects by all accounts," Haiyan Wu said slowly, "and production on Earth exceeds projections by 15%. And human workers have improved efficiency on every world where they have been assigned. That is precisely the problem," Seong Ho said with an urgency he could not hide. "And the humans are not serving us because they accept our rule, but because they are pursuing a strategy we do not understand." He transmitted the data he had compiled over the past 6 months, and he watched the counselor's expression change as the old Velthari reviewed the evidence reports from Kethfor, where humans had prevented the reactor. Disaster reports from Verdes Prime were human. Agricultural experts had reorganized food distribution and ended a famine that had lasted 3 generations. Reports from the shipyards of Tehran Station were human engineers had improved construction efficiency by 30%, and beneath all those positive reports was a darker pattern that Seong Ho had finally learned to see on every world and in every facility. Humans had made themselves indispensable to operations that the Dominion could not afford to lose. They held no official power and claimed no authority. But without them, the mining would stop, and the ships would fail, and the food would rot in warehouses that no one else knew how to manage. They are doing what no conquered species has ever done, Seong Ho said as the counselor finished reviewing the data. And they are making themselves impossible to remove. Haiyan Wu was silent for a long moment, and his scales shifted through colors that Seong Ho had never seen on any Velthari face before. "I have lived for 300 cycles," the old counselor finally said, "and I have watched the Dominion conquer 47 worlds, and I have never seen anything like this. What should we do?" Seong Ho asked with desperation creeping into his voice. "And how do we stop them before it is too late?" The counselor shook his head slowly, and his expression held something that looked almost like admiration. "I do not know if we can stop them," he admitted, "and I am not certain we should try." Seong Ho felt his jaw drop open in shock that he did not bother to hide. "The Dominion is built on strength and conquest and control," he said. "And if we cannot control the humans, then everything we have built is at risk." "Perhaps," Haiyan Wu replied. "But consider what happens if we try to remove the humans from our systems." He gestured at the data still displayed on his screen. "The reactor on Kethfor would have exploded without human intervention, and the famine on Verdes Prime would have killed millions, and our shipyards would fall months behind schedule. Then we are already defeated," Seong Ho said with scales that had faded to the pale gray of despair. "No," the counselor said with a strange smile that Seong Ho did not understand. "We are simply experiencing something new." He leaned closer to the screen, and his ancient eyes held wisdom that came from centuries of watching empires rise and fall. "I will present your findings to the council," Haiyan Wu said, "but I suspect they will not listen. And I suspect they will continue to believe that humans are a gift rather than a danger." "And what do you believe?" Seong-ho asked. The old counselor was quiet for so long that Seong-ho thought the connection had failed. I believe, Hyen-woo finally said, that humanity is doing something far more sophisticated than conquest. And I believe that by the time we truly understand what they are doing, it will already be too late to change anything. The communication ended, and Seong-ho stood alone on his observation deck as reports continued to arrive from across the Dominion. Human workers on the homeworld were being welcomed as advisors and technical experts. Human engineers were being consulted on projects that had been classified as top secret. Human administrators were being trusted with information that should never have left Valkyrie hands. The invasion was flowing backwards, and Seong-ho could do nothing but watch as humanity spread through the Dominion like water seeping through cracks in ancient stone. 5 years after the invasion of Earth, Fleet Admiral Seong-ho stood on a space station that no longer belonged to any empire and watched human ships carry supplies to worlds that were learning how to govern themselves. His scales had faded to a permanent gray that his physicians said was a sign of age, but that he knew was something closer to resignation. The Valkyrie Dominion had not fallen in a single dramatic collapse, and there had been no great war or glorious rebellion to mark its end. Instead, it had simply fragmented, piece by piece, as border worlds declared independence, and core systems discovered they could not function without the humans, who had made themselves essential to everything. Seong-ho had received his final orders from the Dominion Council 3 months ago, and those orders had told him to maintain what territory he could, and to prepare for a prolonged period of restructuring. But the Council no longer existed, and the homeworld that had once commanded 47 conquered planets now struggled to maintain control of the 3 moons orbiting its own star. Admiral, a voice called from behind him. Your visitor has arrived. Seong-ho turned to face the human woman who had been announced, and he felt something shift in his chest when he recognized Minji. Despite the years that had changed them both, she wore the formal clothing of a diplomatic envoy now, and her hair had threads of gray that matched his own faded scales. Ambassador Minji, he said with a bow that was deeper than strict protocol required. I am honored that you accepted my invitation. Minji smiled, and the expression held warmth and sadness and something that looked almost like friendship. We have known each other too long for such formality, she said as she took a seat across from him, and I think you have earned the right to call me by my name. Seong-ho sat heavily and studied the face of a woman who had once been a simple worker in a logistics center and was now one of the most influential voices in a galaxy that was being rebuilt. I asked. You here because I need to understand, he said with a directness that surprised even himself. And I need to know if this was always your plan. Minji was quiet for a long moment as she considered his question. Do you know the story of how humans first learned to grow food? She finally asked. Seong-ho shook his head, and his confusion was genuine. Long ago, Minji said. Before we had cities or technology or even writing, we were wanderers who followed the animals we hunted and gathered whatever plants we could find. She looked out the viewport at the stars. The humans were now traveling between as easily as they once crossed continents. But then we learned that if we stayed in one place and planted seeds and tended them with care, we could grow more food than we could ever gather. This is not an answer to my question, Seong-ho said with frustration creeping into his voice. Minji smiled and held up her hand in a gesture asking for patience. The humans who learned to farm did not plan to change the world, she continued, and they did not know that their children would build cities and empires and eventually reach for the stars. Her eyes met his with an intensity that made his scales shift despite his best efforts to control them. They were simply trying to survive, she said, and they planted seeds because planting seeds was what they knew how to do. Seong-ho felt understanding begin to dawn in his mind like light spreading across a planet at sunrise. There was no plan, he said slowly. There was never a plan. Minji confirmed. And there was only survival and adaptation and the patient work of making ourselves useful wherever we found ourselves. She leaned forward with an earnestness that seemed to strip away her diplomatic training and reveal the simple worker he had first heard about from Ji-won so many years ago. We did not decide to bring down the Dominion, she said. And we did not scheme or plot or wait for the right moment to strike. Then, what did you do? Seong-ho asked. We helped, Minji said simply. And we learned, and we made connections with the people around us. And we did our jobs better than anyone expected. She gestured at the station around them, where Velthri and humans and a dozen other species worked together to distribute supplies to worlds in need. And when the old structures began to crack under their own weight, we were already in position to catch what fell. Seong-ho thought about Counselor Hyen-woo, who had died 6 months ago after sending a final message that called humanity the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The counselor believed you were dangerous, he said, and he warned that humanity would outlast us all. Minji's expression softened with respect for an enemy she had never met. He was right, she admitted. And he was also wrong. She stood and walked to the viewport, where ships bearing flags of 20 different newly independent worlds passed by in an endless stream of commerce and cooperation. Humans are not dangerous because we plan better or fight harder or think faster than other species, she said. And we are dangerous because we cannot stop ourselves from helping. She turned back to face him with eyes that held centuries of survival encoded in her genes. We see problems and we solve them, she said. And we see broken things and we fix them. And we see suffering and we try to ease it. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. And we do this even for our conquerors, she said. Because helping is what makes us human. Seong-ho rose from his seat and joined her at the viewport. And for a long moment they stood together in silence. What happens now? He asked. And the question was the same one Ji-won had asked 5 years ago in a garden on Earth. Now we rebuild, Minji said. And we help the Velthri and every other species find their place in a galaxy that is no longer ruled by conquest. She placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that would have been unthinkable when they first met. Your people will survive, she said gently. And you will change and adapt and become something new. And humanity will be there to help you through the transition. Seong-ho felt tears form in his eyes. And he did not try to hide them. We invaded your world, he said with a voice thick with emotions he could not name. And we killed your people and destroyed your cities and took everything you had. Yes, Minji agreed without anger or accusation. And you repaid us by saving us, he said. Minji smiled. And in that smile, Seong-ho finally understood what made humanity so terrifying to those who measured strength in weapons and fleets and conquered territories. That is who we are, she said simply. And that is who we have always been. And that is who we will still be when the last empire falls and the last stars go dark. She walked toward the door, but paused at the threshold to look back at him one final time. Perhaps that is the most frightening part, she said. And perhaps that is also the most hopeful. And then she was gone. And Seong-ho stood alone at the viewport as human ships carried aid to a galaxy that humanity had conquered, not through war, but through something far more powerful. He watched them go. And for the first time in 5 years, his scale shifted to a color that his people associated with hope.